Morning. Morning. It is a real privilege to be able to preach this morning. This is my first time here on a Sunday morning speaking, so you've got to be nice, okay? Because I'm used to speaking in the youth who can be sometimes brutally honest. But I've got to say this morning, I'm really enjoying these all-age items. They're getting crazier and crazier every week, aren't they? Last week, we had the privilege of leading it, and my wife had what could only be described as a sugar rush on stage that left even the children exhausted, wanting to go back to their seats. But it's great at getting some of the messages across, and sometimes hearing some of the children sharing some of these things is exactly in line with what I'm saying this morning, which is fantastic. And we are doing these series. This is the last one of the I am statements of Jesus. Last week we had Dave Hughes, which was great, doing the way and the truth and the life. And he shared that these verses that we're looking at are part of what's called the farewell discourse of Jesus. These are the last few moments, if you like. This is the night before he was arrested and taken away. And so he's about to depart. And we're just going to jump straight in this morning. We haven't got long, so we're going to fly through these verses. And so we're going to look at John 15. If you could put that up on the screen so you can read along with me. And these are the words of Jesus. He says this: I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away. And every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes, that it may bear more fruit. Already you are clean because of the word I've spoken to you. Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I in him bears much fruit. From apart from me, you can do nothing. Thank you. Now, there's a couple of themes here that are running through the Bible. The first is gardens. God likes gardens. In fact, Genesis starts with the Garden of Eden and ends in Revelation 22 with the garden and the vision of the great tree of life bearing fruit. But secondly, there's a theme of vines. You see, the Old Testament refers to Israel, the nation Israel, as the vine or a vineyard because they were meant to bear fruit and bear witness to the world that they were God's people. And yet they didn't listen and they kept on going it alone, a bit like Ben Falaja. He's our representation of Israel this morning. And because they went it alone, they consistently failed to be fruitful in all that God had for them. So when Jesus starts with the words, I am the true vine, what he's basically saying to them is, Israel is no longer the vine. It's me. And I am the true vine. I'm the Messiah. I'm the Son of God. It's me to connect with. And in the Last Supper, what he's saying to the disciples here is, I'm going to be leaving you, but I want to stay connected to you. I want to be united to you. And so he uses this analogy of a vine and of like grapes being united to a vine. And that's how it's going to work. And the reason I think he's using this analogy is because he wants to talk about complete and utter dependence on him. You can see we've been doing all of these I am statements over the summer. And there's actually a bit of a progression in all of these statements from Jesus. He's saying, I'm the bread of life, feed on my words. He's saying, I'm the light, look to me. I'm the way, the truth, the life, follow me. Now he's up to even more. He's saying, I want you to do all those things, but now I actually want you to depend on me. And it's very powerful what he's saying, because he's saying, I don't want my teachings to just be like a bolt-on or an extra in your life. What I want is for my words and for me to be the source of everything you do in your life. It starts with me. It's not add me later. It starts with me. So this year, we went on holiday to Devon. We went camping. Hands up if you like camping. That's not many of you. Hands up, I couldn't even pay you to go and sleep in a tent for a week. That's a lot more of you. That says a lot. Well, we went camping, and we took our trusty old reliable tent that is really heavy and it withstands all the storm. But I got to admit, when we're putting it up, these big, heavy metal poles, it can be a bit of a faff, and it can be quite hard work, especially if it's windy. Meanwhile, the guys next to us pitched up with their fancy new air tent. And they get out the car, they roll it out, he plugs in the pump, he pumps it up in about 2 minutes it feels, and voila, their tent was done. We hadn't even connected the second poles. These guys were done. And I looked at Hannah, I went, we got to get one of them. So when we got home from holiday, we went to go outdoors and we got the sale and we got the last air tent of the one we wanted. And we bought it and we bought all the extras, the carpet, the porch, the footprint, throw it all in. Let's do this properly. And we got it all, we got it home, and we had this great idea at the time to set it up in our garden and to sleep in it overnight. And so we laid it out on the garden, and I get the pump, and I seen this guy do it in 5 minutes, so I start pumping, and nothing happened. And I'm like, what's going on? So I try it again, and every time I start pumping air into this tent, it just releases it all at the same time. And I was getting more and more animated and more frantic that I couldn't understand what was wrong. And I must have tried for about an hour before I gave up and I said, right, kids, get in the car. We're going back to go outdoors. And I get there and I say, you've given me the wrong pump or the wrong adapter. And they look at it and they go, I am so sorry. You see, there was supposed to be this plastic washer on the end of your pump, and you haven't got it. And that made all the difference. I was like, oh, it's okay. Come on, gives it me the washer. I get in the car and I say, Hannah, can you believe they didn't give us this washer, which made all the difference? And she went, ooh. I mean, what do you mean, ooh? And she says, well, I unwrapped the pump and I thought that was part of the packaging. So I threw it away. No. All the fruits of the Spirit in me were gone. I plugged in the pump, and true enough, it came up 5 minutes later. Boom, this huge tent was up, and I was able to do it. You see, once we were properly connected to the source, actually, what went up in a few minutes, this huge air tent was able to be filled. And not only that, all the extras we bought for the tent that would have been completely pointless unless we had the tent, we were able to go into the tent and enjoy everything, all because of the connection of the source at the beginning. And what Jesus is basically saying when he's using this analogy of a vine is he's saying, if you want to do anything of spiritual value, we have to be connected to him at the source. He doesn't want to be the add-on. He's not the carpet, the footprints. He's not the thing that we get everything sorted in our lives and then we go to church for a bit of extra bolt-ons. Actually, what he says is, I want to be the source. I want to be the thing that actually is behind it all. And that affects your families, your work, your relationships, and everything. Because in verse 5, it says, without him we can do nothing. Now, that doesn't mean we're completely immobile. What that means is we can't do anything of spiritual significance that will last in his kingdom unless we are connected to him at the source. So first, we have to recognize Jesus as the true vine, and that will lead us to a complete dependency on him. Verse 2 says, every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away, and every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes. Now, God is referred to in verse 1 as the gardener. Well, I'm not a gardener, okay? So this week I had to get some time with Joan Brown, so I know what I'm talking about today. And last night I was emailing my mum going, does this even make sense? Because when he's talking about the gardener, he's talking about this vineyard. It's probably most likely a grapevine that was surrounded by vineyards, and they were looking to make wine. And now, from what I understand, is a grapevine is not too dissimilar from a rose bush in that it actually needs tending. If it's left just to itself, it will grow tangled and grow in on itself and not be able to become all that it's meant to be. It might still produce, so a rose bush that's not pruned might still produce roses, but they're nowhere near as good as the ones that you want to be given out on Valentine's Day, or if you're like me, every Friday. You don't believe me. All right? So you got them, but they're nowhere near as good as what they could be. And so in order to tend to it, you have to use some secateurs. Secateurs, yeah? All right? And you have to use these to prune it, to cut back the bush, and but that sometimes means cutting it at a point where it might not make logical sense because we're cutting back what seems like good flowers. All right? It might seem like a waste. When I was looking at the grapevines on the website the other day, I found myself on a website called davesgarden.com. I thought, if it's called Dave's Garden, it's got to be reliable. All right? And it said this. It says, when you actually try and grow grapes for the first time, in the first season of harvest, you have to cut back between 70 and 90% of the fruit. Now, to me, that just seems like an utter waste. That sounds crazy. But in order to get a big harvest next year, you have to cut back nearly all of that harvest in the first year in order to be fruitful next year. You see, because if you are making wine, then you don't just need one or two good grapes. You need a whole harvest. They all need to be absolutely ripe. Now, I was going to bring a vine this morning, but I didn't have one. So I went to Tesco's and I got some grapes instead. All right? And you can see that some of these grapes are, well, they're as ripe as you're going to get from Tesco's. But then you get a few that are like shriveled and small and they haven't seen much daylight. And what basically the analogy here is that in order to make good wine, in order to be able to do that, you need all of your fruit to be fruitful. And it doesn't work if it's been shriveled and been deprived of daylight or if it's got in its way. So what's really interesting in all of this is that Jesus isn't saying, we're talking about branches here that aren't bearing any fruit at all. No, he says those branches are taken away. They're good for nothing. He talks about pruning those that do produce fruit. So that doesn't always seem right. It might seem like a bit of a waste. But you see, God's not satisfied with okay. He's not satisfied with just a bit of fruit in our lives and some evidence of fruitfulness in our lives. In fact, he says, no, I'm going to cut you back so that you can be even more fruitful. You see, about 10 years ago, Hannah and I went to South Africa with Elijah when he was like 10 months old. And we were part of a church there doing some leadership training, and we loved it. And we came back from South Africa absolutely buzzing. We were ready to change the world. We wanted to plant a church. We wanted to start a ministry. We were like, let's go. And then looking back now, God took us immediately into a season of pruning. It didn't make sense. We were ready to go. We were, in my view, we were starting to bear fruit. And we found ourselves in Manchester, which rains a lot. And a church that says, well, we don't need any new church plants or ministries leading, thank you very much. And then I found myself unemployed. And it was some of the hardest times of my life. And at the time, I had absolutely no idea why that was happening, why God was using that time to prune us. And it's only much later does God start to show you that actually in that season, we had to become completely dependent on him. And he started to humble us and knock out our confidence in our own skills and abilities and start to instead depend on him and what he had for us. And in my season of unemployment, I still was like, well, what was all that about? And then I was talking to some lads here on 313 who are unemployed, and I was immediately able to identify what they were going through because I had experienced it myself. And all of a sudden, you start to see what God was doing all that time ago. It felt like brutal pruning. But God is a gardener that we can trust. You see, he doesn't just know how to prune, and there is an art to it at the right angle and everything like that. He doesn't just know how to prune. He knows what areas need pruning, and he knows when to do it. All right? And so he wants to do even more in us by doing that. I was talking to Rob and John just before the meeting. I was thinking, how can we weave a football illustration into this? And I was thinking, it could be like my team that lost its best player, Harry Kane. And then he goes and it feels like we cut back and then all the other players start doing well. But then I thought, I can't do that. I can't go down a football route. I especially can't use the borough as an illustration because that's just pruning gone wrong. That's just sad. Anyway, moving on. Verse 4 goes on to say, abide in me and I in you. The branch that cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine. What he's saying, and in other versions it says if we remain in him and we spend time with God, then actually bearing fruit becomes inevitable. Abiding in him is that, and you heard it with some of the answers from the kids, it's that personal connection with Jesus, and can I say this, that is completely unique to you and to God. You see, God just wants to build a relationship with us and spend time with us. How we do that, there's no rule book. We can read his word, we can pray, we can go and listen to some worship music, we can get out. But actually abiding is about that connection with God, where it's more than emergency prayers when you need something. It's that desire to be in the presence of God just because you enjoy being in the presence of God. That's what abiding is. And when it says abiding will bear fruit, the fruit we were talking about, one of the kids came up with the answer. The fruit I'm talking about here is the fruits of the Spirit. In Galatians, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. These character qualities are the spiritual fruit that we can live out in Jesus. And the fruit is visible through your character. And that is how the world knows that we abide in Jesus. You see, when I was younger, I deeply admired this guy who has since passed away. He was a pastor of a church in South Africa, and his name was Simon Pettit. And if anyone's ever spent time in a New Frontiers church, you might know the name. He was highly regarded by people like Dave Holden and Terry Virgo. And here's why. Because Simon was one of those guys that when you were in his presence, he just seemed to ooze the fruits of the Spirit. He just had this absolute abundance of love for people. And he just seemed to have and carry this joy in his heart. Yet he was patient and he was kind. He was just an absolute giant of a man. But you looked at him and thought, that is somebody that doesn't just read the Bible, go to church. That is somebody that actually enjoys spending time with God. That is somebody who abides in God. And in verse 8, Jesus says, this is to my Father's glory, that you bear much fruit, proving yourselves to be my disciples. You see, when we do start to demonstrate love, joy, peace, patience, the people around you begin to see there's something different in you. Your work colleagues, your school friends, your college friends, no matter where you are in life, but you affect the world around you because somebody says something is different about that person. It's fruit, and it's fruit that comes from abiding and spending time in Jesus. And you see, the people of Israel couldn't do this, and we're no longer asked to follow a nation or a people group. We're asked to follow a person and depend on him. And Ethan, if you could pop up that slide for me on the vine and the grapes. And you see, if you look at a picture of grapes that have been pruned and are looking healthy, you don't need any more evidence to know that the branch is healthy, because it must be to produce fruit like that. It must be. We are the branches. If we're healthy, we'll produce fruit. You can tell by its visible fruit. And that tells you everything you need to know because it is evident. So I just want to recap this morning as we begin to start to draw this to a close. In fact, I'll invite the band back up now. And I just want to recap some of these things. So if you put up the last slide for me, Ethan, that's basically through these verses that we've gone through this morning, we need to recognize Jesus as the true vine, because that leads us to complete dependency on him. When we do that, we accept that he says the words that we are branches. We are the branches, but we have to face up to the reality that branches require pruning. And lastly, if we abide in God, if we spend time with him, if we make time for Jesus, we make room for him in our lives to spend time in his presence. If we abide in him, then that will inevitably lead to fruit. We can't just try and be fruitful, which will last, unless we are connected to Jesus at the source. So there's a few different ways that we might respond to these verses from Jesus. Before we go into singing, I want to ask a couple of questions, really, because there might be people here today that will respond in different ways. You might be a Christian, you might have a faith in God, but you know that he's not the source of your life. He might feel this morning like an add-on, an extra, something that comes later. And it's time to say to him, Jesus, I need to reorder everything here and start realizing that you're the vine and I'm a branch, and I need to connect with you this morning as the source of my life, not an extra or a bolt-on later on. Maybe that's just something for you. Secondly, you might be in a season where God is pruning you and it is hard. But today might be realizing and accepting and saying to Jesus, you're the gardener. You know what you're doing. I trust you. You know what areas in my life need pruning. You know exactly how to do it, and you know exactly when to do it. So today is about putting your trust in him. And by the way, be encouraged, because if he is pruning you, you must have been doing something right. He doesn't prune the branches that don't bear no fruit. He prunes the branches that were bearing fruit. So be encouraged that this isn't a punishment. This is because what God has so much more for you. Lastly, today might be a response to say to Jesus, I need to get back to abiding in you. Look, it's the end of the summer holidays. For some of you who are parents, you might have just lost routine or something over the summer. And today might be this. It might be saying, God, I need to abide in you again. I need to spend time in your presence. I need to connect with you because I want to be fruitful in all areas of my life so that the world around me may know that I'm a disciple of Jesus. Amen.